Now, one way to understand what science is, essentially, is not to look for a formal definition, but to take what one may call a sociological or an anthropological perspective. Science is a human enterprise. It is a human activity, operating and evolving according to intersubjective rules. To use Wittgenstein's metaphor, it is a kind of a game, or maybe akin to a game. There are rules. Rules are made by humans, like the rules of football or basketball. But notice that even though these rules are made by humans, they are not really arbitrary. For example, they cannot be changed on a whim, and also cannot be changed in a one-sided fashion. There's an important element of social consensus behind them. Now, in general, I have to say that I personally hold this kind of anthropological approach, if you want, in very high esteem. This way of looking at things is going to be highly important throughout this course. So I would make a strong claim that one cannot really point to a formal definition of scientific enterprise, and instead we humans, human culture, reserves the name of science as a seal of approval or as a badge of honor to those disciplines or systems of disciplines which appear to us to have the highest degree of certainty, to the kinds of theories that performed the best in terms of the verification procedures that our culture has come up with. Now, as I said, I like this way of looking at things, but I should also warn you that this is a controversial definition, and many scientists and many philosophers of science will not share it. And also, highly controversially, from the standpoint of this definition, there is absolutely no interesting difference, or no interesting essential difference, between science, philosophy, religion, morality, politics. So I would say, for example, that the difference between science and religion, according to this way of looking at things, is ultimately that there is an incomparably higher degree of consensus in what we call hard sciences, compared, for example, to the major branches of the major world religions. Science and scientists tend to agree, though not always, but much more, I could even say incomparably more, and actually maybe even agree for qualitatively different reasons than, for example, the major traditions of the major world religions, which disagree in essential ways between each other. And moreover, it's not even exactly clear how one would adjudicate between different religions, let's put it that way. Which brings me to an important next point, which is this. I sometimes find that students have this misleading impression that whereas science and philosophy are fundamentally uncertain, religion is somehow radically different in the sense that it is immune to these kinds of uncertainties and, so to speak, provides something like a shortcut to truth. Now, I think it's actually quite easy to demonstrate, in a fairly straightforward fashion, that this position is completely untenable, if I may use that phrase. And the reason, which I've actually already alluded to, is very simple. The major religious traditions disagree. In crucial respect, disagree among each other. And not only that, but even within any particular given tradition, we can see how the dominant interpretations first of all change with time, and secondly, maybe even more importantly, take, I don't know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, or what have you. All the major traditions have various competing interpretations. To take just one example, think for a moment how many denominations of Christianity exist. 5, 10, 20? Well, actually, latest sociological research tells us that there are 40,000 denominations of Christianity, approximately. And I'm sure there are new denominations appearing almost daily. And I'm sure that many, if not most of these denominations, believe that their interpretation of the Bible is the only correct one, and everybody else is basically going to hell. So basically, if one chooses to trust this priest, or this book, or this prophet, one has to be able to give a certain rational account as to why they prefer this particular branch and not some other. So, in exactly the same fashion that scientific theories require justification, religious worldviews require justification as well. And so, in some sense, if one wants to be a good religious person, one first has to be a good philosopher. And if one digs deeper, there are problems upon problems with religious worldview in general. Without going into detail now, let me just mention one. So, most religions rely on a particular canon of a body of ancient sacred writing. But immediately the problem is that the originals of these texts, like the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas, are lost, and the languages in which they were written are technically speaking dead. Not to mention that I think, strictly speaking, these texts were only supposed to record the original oral tradition. And this transition from spoken word to writing is deeply problematic in its own right, for reasons I don't want to go into right now. But in any case, it is now very much a matter of deliberate conscious choice. Which texts should we consider sacred? How to translate them? And more importantly, how to interpret them? And again, I think it's crucially important to remember that religious texts do not interpret themselves. The Bible, for instance, does not have a theory of the Bible, or the Quran, the theory of the Quran. And what I mean by this is that there is no separate chapter in these books, a chapter that, again to repeat myself, would explain who wrote this book and why, which texts or which verses are supposed to be included. Again, remember that different Christians would include different books in the Bible, and in general some guidelines as to how the sacred text should be read and understood. Now, maybe that's too much to ask, but I mean, after all, we could imagine a different world in which a given sacred text would project its meaning, so to speak, directly into the head of the believer, such that there is no misunderstanding and no controversy. But that is very obviously not what happens in our world. Notice also that the Quran or the Christian New Testament or the Hebrew Bible are actually not the oldest religious texts in existence. For example, historians tell us that the Rig Veda predates the Bible by maybe something on the order of 1,000 years. And I think in a very important sense, one has to ask that if we allow, in principle, for miraculous sources of knowledge, if we allow for the possibility of disclosure of truth directly through divine revelation, through a connection of an individual human intellect to the mind of God or goddess or some kind of other divine figure, how is it possible that there are many revelations and that they differ from one another? One natural answer would be that, so to speak, human intellect is imperfect at receiving revelation, and whereas divinity, that is, God or gods, do not make mistakes, but human prophets who record the revelations can make mistakes. Well then, but how do you know which portion of religious texts are true and which are mistaken? In that case, you would kinda need science, or some other form of independent verification, to tell you what is true about Rig Veda or the Quran, which would kinda make the religious text superfluous and unnecessary. Wouldn't you agree? Or at any rate, to the extent that one decides at the end of the day to be religious, one first has to establish their religious conviction in a philosophical or a scientific fashion. So the upshot is the exact reverse of the thesis from which we began. It is patently not the case. Science is uncertain, but religion is certain. In fact, it seems to be exactly the other way around. Religion is completely uncertain, unless it is independently grounded in some form of science. As an afterthought, let me also mention one other thing. Of course, religious people very often talk about faith, how you're supposed to have faith as opposed to relying on clear and certain proof. Faith, in the eyes of uncertainty, would then be seen as something admirable, praiseworthy, leap of faith in the dark. But again, if one looks around and asks about themselves or about other people they know, why are they themselves religious? The story is often extremely mundane. For the vast majority of people, they are religious because of their immediate social environment. Their parents, most often. So, far from being admirable, seems to be a fairly pedestrian reason. Now, again, let me underscore that I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to undermine religion or religious faith. If one, having examined all the arguments, at the end of the day decides to be religious, that's perfectly fine. And of course, any rational person starting out the inquiry should be open to the possibility of all the outcomes under consideration. Seems like a basic rule of logic or rationality. So in no way am I trying to be anti-religious. I'm just trying to stress that there's a certain primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis religion, rooted in a very simple fact that one has to choose to be religious in a particular way. And there's nothing obvious or automatic about this choice. And note also that the refusal to make a choice usually means that others make this choice for you. Or to put it differently, if you do not think for yourself, others think for you. And some people may find that okay, but students I talk to usually don't. Is that a knockdown argument? Well, for better or for worse, philosophers don't really trade in knockdown arguments.